Probably the founder of this very event, if I could guess.
Yep.
Yep, I think so.
Just right. Looks just right. Okay. Can you hear me back in the back? Here's my judgment of the United States bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6 and August 9, 1945, when I was 13 years old in Harrison, Arkansas. For 7 decades, the United States public and much of the world have been subjected to a disinformation campaign designed to hide the real reasons and the real human costs of the atomic bombings. The campaign is still today partly successful. What is ultimately at stake? Let's ask right off. Possession of the bombs from 1945 to the present destabilized the world. Ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States has employed nuclear weapons as the center of its strategy for maintaining global domination. United States leaders have repeatedly used the threat to use nuclear weapons to achieve United States interests. In response, country after country, beginning with the Soviet Union, has built its own nuclear arsenals. Nuclear weapons of all kinds abound today. Only one solid solution exists for a safe future from nuclear holocaust, and that is the abolition of the nuclear bombs, and Professor Hobson will speak about that in a moment. Understanding the necessity of abolition begins with an understanding that the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were not necessary, and you know many other words to apply to it. The beginning of World War II in the Pacific. In the United States, the bombings are still widely seen as a decision of last resort against an enemy that in 1941, as I recall, stabbed the United States in the back from the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It was said every day in my hometown. And then in 1945 was an enemy determined, Japan was an enemy determined to fight to the death. But writers during the past 2 decades have questioned these claims. And so I'm speaking today about the scholarship of the last decade that has called into question the rationalizations of our government in 1945. Was the United States stabbed in the back by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor? Is a question we've all asked, and the question has been asked since I was a child. Or did pre-war colonial United States share responsibility for the attack? During the 1930s, Imperial Japan rampaged across East Asia, taking Korea, Manchuria, much of China. The United States increasingly opposed this expansion. In 1940, the United States barred exports of planes and war material to Japan. In early 1941, Washington choked the Tokyo government further by tightening exports of petroleum. Then in early July 1941, not far from Pearl Harbor, the United States and Britain announced a total embargo against Japan. By December of 1941, over 90% of Japan's oil supply was cut off, as was nearly 70% of its overall trade. Roland Worth, a member of the Republican Party, Roland Worth, in a book entitled No Choice But War, shows how the United States-led embargo was decisive in Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor and declare war on the United States. That is, Mr. Worth makes a well-documented case that World War II in the Pacific was an imperial conflict between the United States and its allies and Japan, and it was a racist conflict. The United States supported Dutch, French, and British colonial conquests for resources, but opposed the Japanese for the same purpose in a mutual war without mercy. It's the title of one book about that, about the war in the Pacific. Imagine for the moment with me the Pacific Ocean the day before Pearl Harbor. Imagine a map. Imagine the United States westward movement which began in Jamestown during the 19th century and early 20th centuries. Imagine or remember the great naval base of San Diego. Crossing the Pacific, the greater base at Hawaii. Then the Midway Islands were moving west, our empire's moving west, Guam, the Aleutians and Alaska to the north earlier, the Philippines to the south, and on the continent, China and Britain, France, the Netherlands, controlling all of Southeast Asia, all in alliance with the United States. And the United States cries to the world, stop sending key raw materials to Japan. And the Japanese think, inspired by President Bush's pre-ghost, we must attack preemptively or lose all. And that was the truth. This is how we should remember the beginning of World War II in the Pacific, how remember Pearl Harbor ought to be understood in this historical context. Now let's go to the end of the World War II in the Pacific. Let's move to the end of the war. President Harry S. Truman and United States military leaders believed an invasion of Japan might cost 500,000 of our troops. Some officials said perhaps 1 million. And the bombs would save all of those lives. Instead, the troops, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, would go. They claimed it was a last resort, one of the principles of Catholic Church just war doctrine. True? Let's look at those assumptions and the unspoken motives for the bombings. Was the invasion necessary? Did our leaders lack alternatives? Were the bombings a last resort? Did our leaders make every effort to avoid mass murder, either under ordinary morality or just war principles? And the answer is no to all of those questions in the eyes of the new scholarship. No good reasons support the bombings, while 6 facts about our leaders explain how indefensible was the slaughter. Demonstration of that bombs were never tried. Racism was pervasive in policy and process. Revenge inseparable from the heartbeats of their leaders. Absolute, unconditional surrender was demanded. Fear of losing an election if the bombs were not dropped, and most of all, the desire to end the war before the Soviets swept southward and gained Manchuria, possibly North China, certainly Korea, and maybe Japan, part of Japan itself, it was worried. A demonstration on a deserted island was proposed, but rejected. The option was never seriously considered. The racism of United States leaders in public pumped up patriotism and hastened bomb preparation. I certainly remember the patriotism. I had a victory garden myself. The propaganda of the war without mercy moved westward across the Pacific, united our leaders and the people in hatred for thee, one of the statements, stinking little savages who should be wiped off the face of the earth. Not an unusual statement. All leaders and most of the public wanted revenge for Pearl Harbor. Remember Pearl Harbor rang in our ears and filled our eyes day and night. Unconditional surrender. Think of it. The big three leaders demanded absolute surrender. That is, total humiliation, including removing the emperor, even though the big three knew that would harden Japanese resistance. And then, after Japan's defeat, they accepted the emperor. This is point number 5. Leaders felt the spending of $1 trillion for the Manhattan Project, building the bombs, had to be justified by their use or they would not be reelected. How could we spend that much money for nothing? They worried. Finally, the most important flaw in the United States defense of the mass murder of the innocent people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki relates to the Soviet Union. This is when this Cold War began. Truman, his cabinet, his military officers wanted to warn the Soviet Union to beware U.S. power and not to expand. They could see them, they thought, taking over all of Asia. The bombs terrorizing diplomacy dominated strategic thinking at the highest level of the United States government. The official United States rationalization for this Holocaust, the civilians of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had to be sacrificed to save our troops, is partly true, but only if all other considerations are erased, which I've just summarized. 2 civilian cities were incinerated out of contempt for Asian humanity, to fulfill a revengeful doctrine of total surrender, humiliate the treacherous and vicious Japs, as we call them, avoid public criticism, and intimidate the Soviet Union and all nations of the world for United States supremacy, a process, a policy that continues today. My conclusion. After August 6 and 9, the United States soon expanded the atomic into the hydrogen bomb at the expense of the Marshall Islanders, and the bomb innovations, proliferations, and militarization of society continue today. It is a sobering reality on this grave evening for us to remember. But it's not a hopeless reality. My favorite novelist, Thomas Hardy, in the 19th century, wrote a poem in which he wrote that if you and I seek a better world, we must first look at reality's worst, not evade or deny the truth. Out of that reality has risen the movement to abolish nuclear weapons, and I trust your presence here tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick. We are so lucky to have you. I love the T-shirt, by the way. You see that? The weapons of mass destruction. We found them. It has a map of all of our nuclear weapons. That's good. Very nice. Well, we thought we would, between maybe our keynote speakers, we would place a poem. And our poet has actually contributed to this event quite a few times over the years. And you probably remember, he's another professor emeritus from the U of A of music this time, a poet and a trombonist, of all things, Jerry Sloan. Let's have it. Mr. Jay Sloan.
Hey, Jerry.
Thank you, Kelly. We invoke the language arts to help us better understand the human condition in song and verse. I think I was invited on the strength of my last published collection, which is called Paper Lanterns, which was framing a ceremony that they have annually at the Peace Park in Hiroshima, where they put inscriptions on paper lanterns at sunset and float them down the river. And I use that metaphor hopefully for the poems in that collection, and also for the people in my life that sort of light our way through the darkness. So rather than read from that collection, which some of you own and have heard before, I decided to read some new work instead. And because the poems begin with a quote from W.H. Auden, the great British poet, I would like to go ahead and read the last 22 lines of his famous poem, September the 1st, 1939, which in some ways is prophetic of the horrors of World War II. All I have is a voice to undo the folded lie, the romantic lie in the brain of the sensual man in the street, and the lie of authority whose buildings grope the sky. There is no such thing as the state, and no one exists alone. Hunger allows no choice to the citizen or the police. We must love one another or die. Defenseless under the night, our world in stupor lies, yet dotted everywhere, ironic points of light flash out wherever the just exchange their messages. May I, composed like them, of arrows and of dust, beleaguered by the same negation and despair, show an affirming flame. I'm not the first to read that poem at an Omni event. My friend John Rule has also read it. So W.H. Auden's name was Whiston. So I'm going to read 7 brief poems, 10 lines each from a work in progress, which I'm calling Eternity as a Contact Sport. And it's 70 lines, so you'll know how to pace your concentration or your urge to squirm in these not very comfortable chairs. Whiston said, "We must love one another or die." How many species lately have gone AWOL? Extermination is what we do best. The atomic bomb and reptilian brain, completely incompatible. I Googled the drain fly in my bathroom. 3/4 of the information how to kill, not how to understand them or appreciate how efficiently they recycle the sludge in our tub. 2, bug splat. By the way, that's military terminology for assassinations with Predator drones. Politicos are playing dominoes with our lives. To the weapons industry, we're merely crash test dummies, totally expendable. There's gold in them Nar hills, the guiding principle of entrepreneurs everywhere. The ruins of Hiroshima still smolder in our dreams. No amount of tossing and turning can smother them. What will we tell our grandchildren when there's nothing left to kill? 3, Satsuma. Oranges, a town in California, a place in southern Japan that made a famous brand of pottery collected by my father after the war, perhaps out of guilt at seeing cities laid waste by the atom bomb, lost in the Moriarty tracery of feudal scenes outlined with delicate gold leaf care, as if so many lives were merely shards of shattered earthenware. Memorial Day. Your generation crashed the gates of hell, the Rhine maidens impersonating geishas, harmonizing like the Andrews sisters, a fife and drum ditty for Cantus Firmus, a little martial music, if you will, provided by a band of legionnaires, say Schnagon's ghost reciting a list of all that was lost, artifacts and lives which overflowed the seven seas, and on this day give us reason to pause. 6 August 1945. By the way, I don't remember this date, but I was only a gleam in my father's eye, but my father was, as a sailor in the United States Navy, was present at Hiroshima and Nagasaki within days of the bombing, and also stayed in that region for the 2 tests that they did at the Bikini Atoll 2 months later. And in case you haven't connected the dots, that's why we have Marshallese neighbors in Springdale, just a few miles north. 6 August 1945. For the first time in history, man usurped God's prerogative to wipe the planet clean, snuff out his creation in a twinkling. If warfare is madness, we were mad in the extreme in our vainglorious attempt to harness the atom, our reptilian brain and nuclear energy grotesquely incompatible. Mythology fails us, who pulled back the veil, lifted the lid to Pandora's box, releasing the genie from its damnable lamp, which left silhouettes in cement. Words fail us, proverbial ostriches, heads helplessly buried in the sand, when reality exceeds our ability to disbelieve, paralyzes our will to take those impossibly difficult steps toward disarmament. Floating world. When it came time for Makiko to go, she turned to us before boarding the bus and uttered, "It is raining in my heart," which may have been a Japanese cliché, but seemed more poetic than anything I could say then or now. And whither today exchange students with names ending in "co," swallowed by the workday world of jobs and motherhood, whose passage left indelible footprints then and now. The last poem is the title poem of the collection I'm working on. Working title, Eternity as a Contact Sport. In the early August heat, a chickadee is so thirsty it settles for a drink in the drip pan of my begonias. So close to my perch on the upper deck, I could reach out and touch its airy desperation. Birds of a feather, we could measure together the sun's intense displeasure, guess if we would its origin, some wormhole in the fabric of space and time, where the myriad dead have come to mingle with those of us yet living. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, very much. Okay, well, we have another keynote speaker, and another keynote speaker I probably don't really have to introduce, because everybody here, it's kind of a household name. If you read the newspaper, But another professor emeritus from the university, this time of physics, and the author of many books, and a tireless speaker of peace and justice to all of us.